Hello and welcome to my bookshelf. Today I'm excited to do another book chat with you. And if you're not familiar, my book chats are basically like the book discussion. Whereas in the review I try to focus mainly on, what the book is about and what I thought about the book and the reading experience. So my thoughts and feelings about just like the general reading experience is in my review. But there's some books that I really want to delve in deeper, and I really just want to discuss some of the topics and some of the messages and some of the themes of the book with you guys. So that's what these book chats are. So it's kind of running under the assumption that you at least know what this book is about, or you've read this book before, or you don't care about spoilers. So that being said, let's just jump into my thoughts on the themes of 3 Years with the Rat. So this is kind of hard to explain, but I'll try to do my best. Our main character's sister, Grace, and her boyfriend, John, are scientists, and they have mysteriously disappeared a year apart from each other. And this book is written in a unique way, so the format of the book is a little confusing. So you start off with like August of 2008, then it jumps to August of 2007, and then it jumps to August of 2006. And then from there it jumps to September of 2008, and September of 2007, and September of 2006, and so on. So you're going back, but then you're also jumping forward, and then you're going back, and then you're jumping forward. So it's kind of a weird reading experience, but once you get used to it, it really is no big deal. During the 2008 phase of things, our main character is trying to figure out what happened to Grace and John because they mysteriously disappeared. And he gets access to their apartment, and he's looking around it. There's this rat, and there's this big box lined with mirrors. So, like, if you're inside and you're enclosed in the box, which he ends up doing at one point, you're just completely surrounded by mirrors, which is very interesting. And something weird happens. It freaks him out. He breaks one of the mirrors, and he gets out of the box, right? He experiences a very weird sensation, and he does not like it, so he gets out of Dodge quick, right? So that's kind of the start of the book. And then we kind of jump back in time, and we get a little bit of the interaction with our main character and John, because in 2007, Grace has disappeared, but John hasn't yet. So there's, we get to understand a little bit of their relationship, and then in 2006, Grace hasn't disappeared yet. So there's a lot of trying to figure out, like, what happened to her, and what she was actually studying that led to her disappearance. And it's a very interesting, very engaging story all the way throughout. It's very cool. And ultimately, what you find out is that Grace is trying to measure subjective experience, and their goal is to try to do it in the absence of objectivity. So basically, she's trying to measure, again, your own subjective experience without, like, objective reality. It's just you in and of yourself, like without everything else interacting with you, I guess. She's pretty much trying to eliminate everything else that would interact with your own subjective experience that would change it in some way. It's very confusing, very complicated. A really good example that she uses in the book is, like, to understand more of like what subjective experience she's talking about is she talks about time and how that is very subjective for each person and in each unique situation. So sometimes an hour feels like 20 minutes, and sometimes an hour feels like 3 hours. It just depends what you're doing, what mindset you're in, all of that. So again, there's this really interesting interaction between our own subjective experience of this objective reality that is time. So even though the same amount of time passes at the same rate for an hour, two different people can be in the same room, but it might feel like a completely different experience for the other person, just like in their sense of time, not everything else that makes you unique. So it's a very interesting scientific goal, to say the least. And you find out also that Grace has had a traumatic childhood. And so Grace clearly has some kind of depression because of what happened to her. And it's something that she's never really been able to shake off completely. So she's constantly searching for a way to, I think, remove herself from the pains of her past and the pains of her trauma. And probably also just like the pains of her depression. So she's trying to remove herself from everything that's caused her all this pain throughout her life. and I guess the hopes that it'll be better when it's just her. So again, there's a lot of talk that seems similar to like suicide, where she's trying to remove herself from her own objective reality, which is definitely a scary thought. There's a lot of really interesting quotes in here. So one of them, there's a discussion about what Grace is doing and, you know, why she ended up where she did. And so the quote is, "Oblivion is the annihilation of the self. Grace was looking for the opposite, a way to remove everything but the self." And then it goes on to say, you know, "Didn't that ever offend you, that we're all just obstacles in her desire to be alone?" And this is our main character talking to John, which is Grace's boyfriend, and fellow scientist. So that quote really stood out to me for a lot of reasons, but it really helps to understand Grace's motivation, because at this point we're not really sure exactly why she did what she did, and we're slowly starting to understand. And ultimately that's what she does do, is she's able to remove herself from objective reality. So she ends up in this place that I can only describe as the Upside Down. Basically, it's this alternate reality that overlays, you know, our objective reality, right? So there's like another reality behind this one, the Upside Down. Though their version of this is different, so it's not like everything's like decrepit but all the buildings are there. Like this is almost like a time before the buildings were even there, like a time before humans were even there. It's very interesting. So it's the same like geographical location, but unless you know what the, you know, layout of the land was before all the buildings and people came around, you really have a hard time recognizing it. So it's very interesting in that regard. But yeah, so you're taken to this upside down place, and that's where Grace has been for this last 2 years, or a year and a half, I'm not really sure at this point. But Grace was able to remove herself from what we would consider reality, and she's there by herself, and she's caused this infinite loop, which I'm a little foggy on exactly how that works. It's something I would have to reread. So my understanding is that she's constantly entering into this subjective reality, so then there ends up being multiple Graces. It ends up being like hundreds of them, to be honest. But yeah, after a certain period of time, I'm not really sure how long, again, it's all subjective, right? So let's say every month a new Grace pops into this upside down. So at first she was alone, and then like Grace number 2 comes in, and then at first she loves it. Like she gets to have discussions with herself. You know, they can extrapolate all these really interesting scientific ideas, and they can bounce things off of each other, and she just loves it. By the end of it, like the oldest Grace there, if you will, the one that's been there the longest, she's gotten to the point where she's sick of it, and she says, "I've just had my fill of being alone. I'm tired of things being inescapable, incomprehensible." So not even being alone has helped her. Eventually, like, even being alone is not good. She doesn't seem to have any interest of going back with our main character, which is why it really puts me on edge, because, you know, like, what is the other solution here for her then, you know? Grace thought that this alternate reality, this subjective reality, if you will, was going to be like a haven for her. And it was at first, but then, you know, as human beings, like, we crave connection to other people. That's just how we're made, right? So we're built to be in relationship with other people, and when you completely, you know, remove that, it's maddening. And she's experiencing that, and she's realizing that she wasn't right. The sad thing is, though, she does leave at one point. She talks to our main character, and she's begging him to come with her and all this kind of stuff, but he doesn't go. So there's that desperation there. And again, for me, like, when I think of Grace, I do think about the suicide and all that. So it just breaks my heart when I read that scene when she's just begging for someone to come with her, and he lets her down. And that's why later on, because that was in 2006. So then in 2008, that's when he's very adamant that he needs to go in, he needs to find her, he needs to save her. So he goes in, and he you know, he tries his best to get her out of here. So another cool thing about the Upside Down is this idea that you'll always find what you bring with you in this Upside Down. Again, if this is supposed to be like subjective reality to some extent, or is the closest thing that we can get to it, then of course, like, there's nothing else to fill up the space other than what you bring with you. And so again, I think this really just goes to show that Grace's problem is more of a depression than anything else. So obviously when she got in there, even though she has all these other different versions of herself, she's ultimately alone, because that's what it feels like when you're clinically depressed. You feel alone, you feel isolated, you lack motivation or energy to do anything. And more importantly, your perspective on things is different. It's not rational. They look on the past and all the pains and all the horrible things that have happened to them, and they just keep ruminating over all these horrible things that have happened to them, instead of looking towards the future and seeing a brighter future. They only see a dark future. They're not able to imagine that things could get better. And that's really the problem with depression. You're not able to really think rationally with your own clear mind, because it's not clear, it's foggy. And something that I've learned about how our brain works, and that's that your brain seeks to validate what it already believes to be true. And basically what that's saying is, if you have this belief somewhere deep inside of you that's been planted that, you know, I am not good at anything, I screw everything up, if you believe that at some level, then you're going to constantly be looking for evidence to validate that experience, to validate that truth, that, see, I can't even pour my juice without spilling, you know. That doesn't mean anything, but you're taking it to mean so much more than it actually does, because you want to prove your point that you can't do anything right. And part of seeking to validate this truth is also ignoring any counter evidence or disproving any counter evidence that that's not true. So even when you do something right, you don't acknowledge it as really being you doing it right. You might just say that, like, well, everyone gets lucky sometimes, and it's not really you that did something right, it just happened to happen, and it wasn't anything that you did, so you're still horrible and you still can't do anything right. It's this distorted thinking that is definitely the problem with depression. We all have, you know, hints of that, but I think depression just amplifies that to this point that is very dangerous, which is why, you know, suicide becomes an option, you know, in people's minds when they're feeling clinically depressed. And we see that with Grace, and it's very tragic. It really, really is. Another really good quote that I think talks a lot to this obsession of Grace's and her depression and all of that is as follows. If you keep following them, everything else will slip away until all you have left are silhouettes and a reflection. So ultimately, one of the major themes of the book is this exploration and this need of Grace's to find this place and to find out why things are the way they are. She's constantly searching for this meaning, and she's soul searching, right? And there's this quote that keeps getting repeated throughout the book that I think is a perfect book to kind of summarize Grace's exploration and her frustration with this experiment of hers. And it goes as follows. I realize that if through science I can seize phenomena and enumerate them, I cannot, for all that, apprehend the world. And this is a quote by someone named Camus, which I'm assuming is some kind of philosopher. But either way, what he's trying to get at is that science is a great thing, and it can help us to understand how things work in the world, but it can't help us understand why things are in the world, or what things mean, or what the purpose is of life, and all these big questions that Grace is trying to discover. But ultimately, she falls short because science can't do that. That's not its function. It's just not within its ability to be able to tell us, you know, all these grand big questions that as humans we strive for and long for the answers to. And that's where the other sciences come in, you know, philosophy, theology, and that's what they strive to understand using logic, is try to figure out like what this whole life thing means and what it is, and you know, what our purposes in this life and what the best way to live is. And that's why philosophy and theology are super important. And it's something that, you know, can go hand in hand with science. Science can take us only so far, and then we need like philosophy and theology to take us the rest of the way to fully, truly understand not only how the world works, but why the world is the way it is, and what are purposes in it. That's one of the many reasons why I like this book, is that it seems to foster discussion about some really interesting topics. He didn't go into any of that stuff that I just mentioned. I extrapolated based off of this book, and I like books that make you think and that make you extrapolate and to really think about things in a unique way. I really love these quotes. I think it really helps me understand things in a way that I never did before. And I think this story is just another really good metaphor for a lot of things that we experience in our everyday life. So it was a really, really good book, and that's why I'm starting to think that I might want to give it a 5-star rating instead of my original 4-star rating. I think a book that's able to get me to think this much and to really enjoy the story as much as I did deserves a 5-star rating. So ultimately, I thought this book was really well written, and I think that it has a lot of really interesting messages and a lot of really interesting themes to talk about. So it's definitely a book that I would highly recommend if you've never read before, assuming that you can get past the fact that you're jumping back in time and the jumping forward in time and the jumping back in time and so on. Which it sounds a lot worse than it really is, I promise. Alright, so that was my book chat on 3 Years with the Rat. I feel like I could have said a lot more, but I definitely said a lot. So I'm going to leave you with that and try not to overwhelm you too much. This is definitely a book that I would love to read like in a book club and really discuss with other people. I think it really lends itself to that, and it would be a really interesting experience for sure. Alright, so as always, I just want to thank you for watching this video, and until next time.